have your gadget, or when you go home, if you have PowerPoint downloaded on your gadget, it should look fine. Because I don't have PowerPoint. So there are two ways to look at cultural variation. One is through subculture, and the other way is through the notion of counterculture. There are two ways to look at cultural differences. So one is through subculture. Another way is through counterculture. So what is a subculture? Subculture means a group of people who are unique and distinct, who has a different lifestyle than the other people in society. We know they are different, we know they are unique and distinct, we know they exist because they are different, but they quietly do their thing. They don't go on the streets, they don't go to the social media to voice their differences and why people should adapt or adopt their differences. We call this subculture. Let me go a step back. Not everybody's culture is the same. So because of that, we have two ways to explain cultural variation. One is through subculture. Another way is through counterculture. So these are the peoples whose lifestyle are unique and different as distinct, but they quietly do their thing. We call them subculture. The druggies, emos, gamers, people who ride on Harley motorcycles. They don't advocate their differences, even though they make their presence known. They have their own unique, distinct lifestyle, right? Another gamer. Or the nudists. All these people have distinct norms and values and belief systems, but they quietly do their thing. Even the rock and roll. They have a different musical style, but they don't really advocate or influence people through their differences. They don't imply telling people from other culture in society that you should be like us. Our way is better. Through social media or through the news or through rallies and protests. So we call these groups of people subculture. Are we clear? The cliques you have in your high school, the cheerleaders, the jocks, the nerds, the skaters, people in the drama group, they are also examples of subculture. Are we clear? Skaters, the rednecks in here. They all quietly do their thing. We know they are different from other people in society, but they are quietly doing their thing. So they are all subculture. Clear? Gymnasts, people who care about their health and they go to the gym a lot. They have a unique and distinct lifestyle too, right? So gymnast is another example of subculture. Are we clear? These are all the other examples of subculture. You can read that on your own when you go home. And another way to explain cultural variation is through counterculture. Counterculture are groups of people who are different, unique, and distinct, but they openly make their differences known. They are implying that maybe you should be like us. Our way are different and better. Some countercultures, they organize to oppose the mainstream culture. Because of that, we know they exist. Because they organize. The punks, they revolutionize their fashion and their music. They openly let people know their presence and them being different. People who participated in the civil rights movement are examples of counterculture. The same thing can be said for abolitionists. They not only organize, but they oppose the mainstream culture. Abolitionists were against the systems of slavery, right? So they organize and they want people to join them in their effort. They are not like subcultures who quietly do their thing. Make sure you can tell the difference between subculture and counterculture. You will need to give examples in your midterm. Are we clear?
Like communism be a counterculture?
Yes. You know why? Can you explain to me why? Very good.
Because it doesn't go with what the norm is. Like,
Mm-hmm. And they organize. And they openly influence people, right? Through their differences, implying that their ways are better. Maybe the same thing can be said for socialism. Now, I think Antifa is still around, right?
yeah.
In California, they are still quite influential. So are they counterculture or subculture? People who protest
I would say
in all these. Yes, very good. People who believe in the socialism ideologies, and sometimes to the point that they hold rallies, protest, they go to the streets, or they hold rallies on campuses. These are all countercultures. Hippies, countercultures, right? They openly voiced their differences. They openly protested against the Vietnam War. Make sure you can tell the difference. If not, you need to ask me now. So these are all examples of counterculture. Black Panthers, no brainer. During the civil rights movement, they were quite radical in going against the Jim Crow law in the South. Terrorists, anarchists, they are all classified as counterculture. ISIS. Now they are gone, but ISIS used to be a counterculture. Some environmentalists, they have a YouTube channel. They say, if we keep doing this to our environment, we are not going to see our earth for very long. They openly voice their concern on YouTube, on other avenues. They want people to buy into their ideals. So they are counterculture. Doomsday's preppers. Oh, look at how our economy is going. It's so volatile. We are going to have a big recession soon. Oh, look at the state of our environment. Doomsday's preppers. Oh, look at how people are living. They are not living right. In fact, they are living in sin. These are all different manifestations of doomsday's preppers. They are also classified as counterculture. Can you all tell the difference? This looks like a very good example question on your midterm. Usually when I teach this class in the fall, because the weather is better in the fall, you have a quiz on these things. Now you have to give examples on your midterm. You will. So take this seriously. Are we clear? And you don't have to follow these examples. Maybe now you can tell the difference. Through my brief lecture, you can come up with your own examples. Are we clear? In your exam. Marijuana supporters. Now I think there are at least two groups of people in this issue. Some support legalization of marijuana, some don't. And they openly voice their opinions, their stance on the internet, on social media, on YouTube and whatnot. And some have lectures on university campuses. So because of that, marijuana supporters are classified as counterculture, not subculture. Are we clear? So, that's another way to explain cultural differences. We can also explain cultural differences through dominant culture or subculture and counterculture. So, dominant culture are people whose mainstream lifestyle, mainstream ideas, people whose practices, ways of life are adopted in society, or peoples whose practices, lifestyle, value system, belief system, ways of doing things are considered the standards in a given society, because usually they tend to be the majorities, or if they are not the majorities, they tend to be the powerful people in that society. They can be the minority. Anybody learn about apartheid system in your history class? In South Africa, apartheid. Am I saying the word right? So, when South Africa was under apartheid, the dominant culture will be all these things as well. The whites, the middle class, Anglo-Saxon, maybe Protestant or Catholics. And the language, the value system, the belief system, the rituals of these minority whites were regarded as the dominant culture in South Africa when it was under the system of apartheid. Are we clear? And in some countries in the US, Nebraska, even though for the most part, different racial groups can coexist peacefully with one another, but the dominant culture is still these things, right? Because the whites are the majorities. In some states, like California, there could be two dominant culture, the Hispanic culture and value system and the white culture. Or even in certain sections in California, the dominant culture could be the Hispanic culture. Same thing can be said for certain parts in Mississippi or in the southeastern states of the US. The dominant culture could be the African American culture and their lifestyle. The dominant culture can also be their values and traditions and belief system, because blacks can be the majority in that area in Mississippi, in Louisiana. Are we clear about the concept of dominant culture? So, the mainstream ideas, practices of African Americans permeates in certain parts of Mississippi because they are the majorities. So, the type of dominant culture can vary by location. Are we clear? It can vary by country. So, in China, the dominant culture could be the Han majority ethnic group. And it can also be the Mandarin language, the beliefs, values, and traditions associated with the Han ethnic group. Are we clear about the meaning of dominant culture? You can think of the dominant culture as the most practiced culture, the most practiced ways of life. Am I making sense so far? So, we've been through this. The majorities do not always rule, right? Apartheid in South Africa was one example where the minority ruled because they had military and political power. They control the military, they control the economic system, and they control the police force back then, not now. Now, the dominant culture in South Africa would be maybe the African culture, African values, African language, or whatnot. Things change after apartheid or after Mandela won the election in the 90s. Clear? So, sometimes people from different cultures, they don't always coexist peacefully, right? It's a no-brainer. And this can be due to ethnocentrism, when we try to understand the culture of another group using our own culture, using our own value, using our own belief system, we are going to have some misunderstanding towards the other group. There are going to be conflicts abound when we try to understand another person's culture based on our own culture, based on our own values, and based on our own traditions and belief. It's never going to be accurate when we try to do things this way. That's the meaning of ethnocentrism. And examples of ethnocentrism would be how the Nazis treated the Jews during World War II. They did not understand the Jews, or even to the point that they perceived the Jews as a threat to their economic well-being, to their political stance, because the Jews, even though they were the minorities in Europe, but they were quite successful in academia, in business, in other domains. And another manifestation of ethnocentrism would be, we still see that today, people from different religious backgrounds going to war with one another, killing one another. Or another manifestation of ethnocentrism would be, we have certain beliefs, unfounded beliefs about someone from another ethnic group, someone from another age group, someone from another gender groups, just because we don't know them well, we don't understand their culture well, we don't understand their value and beliefs system well. So we have certain opinions about another cultural group, and we try to understand another cultural group based on our own culture, our own values, our own beliefs. When we do that, we are being ethnocentric. Are we clear so far? And the opposite of ethnocentrism would be cultural relativism. People who adopt the notion of cultural relativism believe that all cultures are equal. No cultures are more superior or more inferior than others. All cultures are equal. And because of this belief, they appreciate another culture without prejudice. They have a neutral stance when they try to understand another person's culture, belief, and values and traditions. So, examples of cultural relativistic behaviors would be how we treat our pets like dogs. If we see people from another group, they put their dogs to work sometimes. We don't judge. We say, that group is so uncivilized. See how they abuse their animals. If we have this mindset, we are being ethnocentric. We know that some cultures, like the American cultures, your pets are a member of your family, right? You clothe them during winter times. You build nice houses for them with AC and heat. You treat your pets differently. So, we should not judge how people treat their pets if we want to be cultural relativistic. And the same thing for marriage and family practices. Some cultures are okay with cousins marrying one another, and we don't judge. If we judge, we say, oh, that culture is not right. We are being ethnocentric. If we are open-minded pertaining to this, then we are being cultural relativistic. Polygamy. Do you know why some cultures, some groups still practice polygamy, the Mormons. Even in some Muslim or Middle Eastern countries, they still legalize polygamy. And why is that so? Hundreds of years ago, Muslim countries or Arab society were constantly at war. And there were no social welfare system. The political system was different back then, way back then. So when men were sacrificed, were being killed in those wars, who was going to take care of all these widows and women and their families? So because of that, they allow polygamy. It has a historical basis. So if we try to understand why polygamy came about in those societies, we tend to be more neutral when we try to understand why those societies, they still practice polygamy. Are we clear? And some children, they still live with their parents until they get married. It can be into their 30s or 40s. They never leave home. In some cultures, kids are obligated to live with their parents, especially the oldest son, in some cultures. Because of that, we should not judge. If we want to be cultural relativistic. But in those cultures, even though kids live with their parents, sometimes they help pay the bills. They don't live for free. They take care of the parents. And some cultures have extended families. It's expected for some cultures to have multi-generational families in the same household. Again, we should be neutral when we think about this issue. Are we clear? So these are all examples of cultural relativism. And some religions have baptism, and we should not laugh at them. Oh, that religion is so funny. They submerge people in the water. Oh, the practice is so weird. If we think this way, we are being ethnocentric. We try to understand that religious group based on our own religious background. Just because our own religious background don't have this practice, it doesn't mean that they are doing something funny, right? So the same thing for communion service. And certain celebrations like Santa Claus or Easter with the bunny and Halloween, we don't say that culture is so weird. They make holes in their pumpkins. Oh, that culture is so weird. If we have this mindset, we are being ethnocentric. If we try to understand why people carve pumpkins during Halloween, oh, it was because there were no electricity way back then, and people found a creative way to carve pumpkins to lit their homes. Oh, they are so ingenious, in fact. Then, if we think this way, we are being cultural relativistic. Are we clear? And different cultures have different notions for privacy. And we cannot say that, oh, that culture does not know how to respect people's personal space. They stand or they sit so close to one another. Maybe because that culture live in a very congested area. People don't have the leeway to have a ton of personal space. So we cannot judge. Privacy is another example of cultural relativism. We got to think deeper when we try to understand the notion of personal space and privacy. Are we clear? The same thing for burqa, the headdress Muslim women wear, the burqa. And we should not judge when we see a headdress. And Muslim women, they wear a headdress is to be respectful. They don't show their head, one of their body parts, to strangers essentially, or people not close to them, especially guys. It's a sign of modesty. They only show it to maybe their fathers, their siblings, or their husbands. It's a sign of modesty, the burqa, the headdress. The same thing for smoking. We don't say, oh, that culture is so health unconscious. They smoke like there's no tomorrow. If we have this mindset, we are being ethnocentric. If we try to understand, oh, that culture smokes, we put our value aside, whether it's good or wrong, unhealthy or healthy. We put our values aside and we figure that culture smoke, especially among their men, is because the notion of masculinity is deeply ingrained in that culture. That culture is very patriarchal. So it's more acceptable for men in that group to smoke, not for women. We got to think deeper. And corruption can also be an example of cultural relativism. Corruption can also be used to explain cultural relativism. Why some police officers in certain countries they take bribes? They literally stop every cars. Some countries in Latin America, in Asia, maybe in other parts of the world, police officers literally stop every car, whether you speed or not. They stop every car. But now it could be harder, it may be harder. Now on the roads in many countries, they have sensors to show your speed. But sometimes they still do it. Government officials, they take bribes. Police officers, they take bribes. So can we say that, oh, that culture is so uncivilized? Corruption, bribery are still deeply ingrained in their culture. They are so savage. Or if we figure that country, that culture, certain government officers, police, they still take bribes, it's because there's something wrong with the system itself. How decisions pertaining to wages are being made. Police officers, especially low-ranking police officers, they don't make much. So maybe they need to count on bribes to compensate for their meager income. Sometimes we cannot really blame them, quote unquote blame. The same thing for bribery. Some government officials, police officers, they take bribes, especially if their salary is high. They are high ranking. It could be due to greed. But usually police officers who are traffic officers, they are not very highly ranked. We all know that. So we got to think deeper. The same thing for pirate movies and software. Some countries, in many Asian countries, is almost condone pirating movies and software. And if we judge them, we say that culture is so unethical. We are being ethnocentric. Just because maybe we live in certain parts of the world where software are affordable. And in certain parts of the world, software are being imported from first world country. They can be very, very pricey. All these software companies, maybe they have the same pricing for all countries when they export their software. So because of that, sometimes when students, graduate students, undergrads, they need a software for their assignments, for their research. Sometimes they resort to pirated software to get things done, to meet a deadline. Usually in companies in other parts of the world. usually they don't use pirated software. I worked in a bank in the accounting department in Malaysia for 3 years before I came back for grad school. And my old bank, they did not use, not even one, pirated software. I did not have my own computer. I was a bank officer. I did not have my own computer. And most executives or officers don't have their own computers. We have to share computers and software. It was the mid-90s. But no, in all these computers, there were no pirated software. Only the students or the common people in those societies, sometimes they had to resort to pirated software. Question so far. So, there are certain practices in any society that are common to all. Certain things people in all cultural groups, they do, like marriage, funerals, birth celebrations. They have their own marriage practices for each culture. Each culture may have or may do their marriage ceremony differently. But we can say that all cultures have some kind of marriage ceremonies, right? So marriage is one example of cultural universal. Marriage is a common practice with a common values and belief attached to that. But people from different culture do their marriage ceremonies differently. Some get married in church, some get married in Vegas, some have their own marriage traditions where elders are around. They have to serve tea to their elders, Asian cultures, for example. And all cultures have their own funerals. They may do it differently. All cultures have a ceremony to commemorate those who pass away. Some kind of funerals. So funeral can be considered another example of cultural universal. Funerals is another common practice for different cultures, even though different cultures do things differently. Are we clear? All cultures have some kind of language or symbols. Their language may differ. All cultures have their own ways of communicating with one another. We call that language. Their characters may differ. Their writing styles may differ. So language is a common practice for all modern cultures. Because of that, language can also be regarded as an example of cultural universal. Are we clear? All cultures have their own symbols. And symbols like maybe the octagon for a stop sign, certain lights to represent how the cars should react. So these are all examples of cultural universals. All cultures have their own way of saying hello and goodbye, right? So language is an example of cultural universal. All cultures have their own sports. They may have a different sports, a different form of competition. So sports is another example of cultural universal. Some cultures play soccer, some cultures play football. And all cultures have different facial gestures, body language to represent different things. Thumbs up and thumbs down may mean the same or different thing in different cultures. So gestures is another example of cultural universal. All cultures have their own means of exchange. We call them currency. All cultures have their own opinions pertaining to killing. So, the act of killing or the act of burglary, the act of murder, the act of homicide can also be examples of cultural universals. All cultures have their own opinions or how they deal with incest. Incest is sexual behaviors within family members. It's considered a crime in some culture, is overlooked in another culture. But all cultures have opinions about incest. And all cultures have some sort of criminal justice system to punish people who go off track. So because of that, crime or the criminal justice system is another example of cultural universal. Are we clear? I think this is a good stopping point.